Greetings, friends. My enemies hate Russia. Trudeau, the big corporations, Emmanuel Macron, every establishment body that I can think of is telling us to hashtag stand with Ukraine and hate Russians, discriminate against Russians. They tell the masses of the people to do this, and people oblige immediately. The N.P.C.s have switched from Black Lives Matter to COVID to stand with Ukraine, and they've done it without much preparation, right at once, jumping right in. They have no idea what they're talking about. I went to my ATM at my bank a few days after this whole craze started, in late February. And there's this graphic, this digital graphic playing on this screen, like right above the ATM, and it's like the fluttering Ukraine flag, the blue and the yellow, and it said something like support Ukraine or stand with Ukraine or something like that. What the hell is going on here? Pardon my language. Then I was at the pharmacy today, and I noticed that they had some Ukrainian flags, little flags there in the aisle. This is a Portuguese neighborhood. There's Portuguese women working behind the counter at the pharmacy. The doctor was a Brazilian guy. So this isn't a Ukrainian neighborhood. Why do they have these Ukrainian flags? And then above the counter, this big banner, the Ukrainian flag, it says, again, hashtag stand with Ukraine. And I'm thinking okay, if it's a humanitarian effort to help the Ukrainian people who are in hardship, I can sympathize with that. But why is it only one side? And I don't think that's what the hashtag is about. It's about stand with Ukraine, help Ukraine fight or do something that we can do to stop Russia or harm Russia. I don't think it's just a humanitarian thing, but even if it was, why would just one side? Why wouldn't you say, and also help the families of the Russian soldiers who've been killed? But they're not allowed to say that because it's Russia's invading, Russia's the aggressor. Yeah, maybe in some sense, but as I mentioned in a previous video about this, Russia's in a geopolitical situation where missiles could be placed on their doorstep if Ukraine becomes part of NATO. Is that not aggression to you? So, I don't know. Again, these people, you won't be hearing that from the mainstream media. Of course, it's just, you won't be hearing that from even Al Jazeera. You won't be hearing that from the BBC. You won't be hearing that from most media. So what I wanted to say to the women behind the counter at the pharmacy was, I wanted to say, even though I'm not a pro-Russian government supporter, I wouldn't think of myself that way. But just in the spur of the moment, and because the same way that the media hated Trump when he was running initially in 2016, and that made me want Trump to win because all my enemies hate this guy. There must be something. There must be something about Trump that we could use. So when all my enemies just hate Putin and Russia, and I guess they hated Putin and Russia before with Trump, that was tied into the whole thing. But now it's all about Putin and Russia being the big bad guy. If they all hate him, then maybe there's something to look into about this guy. So I wanted to ask these women, why would you just assume that we all want to stand with Ukraine? Why? Ukraine is being used by the West, and it's too bad for the Ukrainian people. The West has been using their country for NATO, for geopolitical reasons, for all sorts of other illicit means. There was the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, becoming CEO of some company in the Ukraine because he had ties to the political establishment in the United States. Now, apart from the military might of Russia, there is also the cultural might of Russia. So why are people so fixated on this Ukraine war when there's 100 other wars going on in the world? Now, according to the conservative YouTuber Ramsey Paul, whom I follow, this has to do with a religious fervor which has its roots in the Puritans of early America, or wherever you want to trace it back. Somewhere in the early modern period, we get this Puritan attitude, and then we see that develop into the abolitionist culture of the 19th century, which played its role in the American Civil War, kind of like a moral crusade, that sort of attitude, and then develops into, in the 20th century, the Pride movement and the rainbow flag, having rejected God. That's the interesting thing, is it came out of this heretical Christianity, and then eventually ended up rejecting God altogether, but it has to always there always has to be some religious vacuum that needs to be filled. So now it's literally a religious conflict in some sense. Like Ukraine should allow children to change their gender. Ukraine should allow babies to die after coming out of the womb, as is being instituted in the West right now. Things like this are important values for this new religion, this global American empire, or gay, as Ramsey Paul terms it. And Russia is a real threat to these kinds of values, at least a threat to their ability to spread. For all of the ridiculous things that our N.P.C.s believe, they may get it right. They may sense on some intuitive level that Russia is a threat, and it is indeed a threat to the picture of reality they are accustomed to. Now we find out about these biolabs in Ukraine. The curious coincidence of finding these biolabs, or however you want to term them, research facilities as the US was trying to spin them, which they first tried to deny that they had any involvement in these biolabs in Ukraine, the Americans that is, and then they later affirmed that they did. And the question is, were you developing biological weapons for use against Slavic peoples and or Russian peoples or other Ukrainian peoples? That question, I'm not sure if there's a clear answer yet, but it would seem to be likely that that might be the case here, that there have been these biological facilities, and Russia is now bringing this up on the world stage. And of course, I'm sure every side has done their own dirty things, but China was backing Russia on this and saying, yeah, we need this investigated. Maybe it's because they got tarnished by people accusing them of letting the original C virus thing happen from a lab in Wuhan. But the funny thing is, from what I mean, if that is the explanation for the C virus, which I'm open to it being the case, I don't really know what the ultimate truth is. But a lot of people I respect believe that theory, that it did come out of the laboratory in Wuhan, like much more plausible than the whole bat soup thing and meat market thing that didn't pass the test of scrutiny. This other theory, perhaps it did come out of a lab, but if you went into that theory, then you find out it's actually the Americans and even Fauci himself being involved with these things and even sponsoring them and moving their facilities out of the United States where they can escape the regulations and the oversight that would stop them from doing some of the more questionable and, dare I say, diabolical things that they want to do. So they do them in countries like China, and they also might do them in a country like Ukraine, where a lot of other shady things happen. Lots of like prostitution, and apparently it's a very important country for child pornography, the Ukraine. So some might describe the country as the elite playground, where they get to do their dirty things. Maybe that's another reason why they're so fixated on this country. But it is this religious fervor Now these biolabs in the Ukraine, though, I wanted to say it's like an interesting inversion of what happened during the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq by the United States, which was a noble thing that all the media were championing at the time. Not to mention all the other things that the U.S. has been involved in since that time. Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, etc., bombing, and all kinds of other wars. Invasions, you might even call them. But this thing in the Ukraine, well, that's different. That's different. It's funny because the Iraq invasion, the pretext that they all told us, the powers that be told us, well, there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Iraq. They said chemical weapons, maybe biological, but I remember they were talking about like chemical weapons there. Like in that movie, what's that movie with Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery? The Rock? That's the imagery, that's what you're thinking of, or you don't know what was this chemical weapons. And then they never found any WMD in Iraq. The story eventually fizzled out of the news, but they never ever came up with anything. And they were called out on it, but there never really was any response. It just moved on. A new president came along, and that was that. People forget about these things, and but what could be, what a grand crime in front of the whole American people, and but inexcusable by all of us. I mean, I'm Canadian, but inexcusable by all of us. But then in Russia, I know it's like a different situation, but you've got Russia coming in there, and then they find they find actual or it's not a 100% that this happened, but they end up finding like the sort of weapons that were claimed existed in Iraq. Maybe a different class of weapons, but generally a similar idea. Biological weapons. I've watched hours and hours of Sergei Baklikov. He's a YouTuber, a Russian YouTuber, who used to call his channel Real Russia. Then he changed it to Baklikov Live. His channel's been around for maybe at least 10 or 12 years. And he got a lot of views because he would live stream. He's a goof, like he's a pretty silly guy, terrible English, but he would do a lot of live streaming walking around Russia, and it was just interesting to see Russian culture. Like, even though he was a bit of a weirdo and sometimes a pervert, he would take you around different cities, mostly St. Petersburg and Ufa, and just you get to see like street scenes and see people and just how life feels there. How there's a lot of different things about Russia, but there's definitely not as many fat people there as there are in the U.S. And there's a lot of beautiful women there. And there's some things that are more run down looking. Like, I haven't traveled to Russia. I mean, I've been to Latvia briefly for 4 days, which is not Russia, but it didn't look too good. And some of the streets were like a little dilapidated. But no, I mean, it came out of the Soviet Union, so that left its mark on all of Eastern Europe. But what I noticed above all, my most important observation, in my opinion, about watching hours and hours of Sergei Baklikov, the goof, going around, and because he has a fixation with going to establishments like bars or usually restaurants or even fast food places, anything new. And especially, they have this problem in Russia where they seem to want to emulate American culture. So they'll have these like a diner or like a rock and roll diner or something based on a movie or some aspect of American culture, or maybe Western culture in general, but specifically like American culture. They try to emulate and create this establishment, and it just ends up looking weird and fake And I just think the Russians should abandon trying to look up to American culture. They actually have a much richer culture of their own that they can draw upon. You don't need American consumerism and stupid plastic diners with posters of Marilyn Monroe on the wall in Andy Warhol style, which looks out of place, and it wouldn't even fit in with contemporary America, which is even more degenerate now. But that's why it's funny, because I'm noticing that, like, I already noticed that from watching Baklakov live, as he calls his channel, for some time now. And now, with all this thing with Russia, Ukraine, we get these American corporations like trying to punish Russia by pulling out their operations from this country. Like apparently McDonald's did that, and then we've got these tech giants, like these Silicon Valley or wherever they're based. They're mostly based in America still, I guess, but like, you know, like Facebook, Twitter, I don't know, maybe Instagram, or I guess YouTube will be next to pull out or either be banned, because you've got Russia banning some of these companies, and then you've got some of these companies like withdrawing their own services voluntarily. But the point is, this is actually good for Russia, because you're now, for one thing, the enemy has less propaganda reach to your people. So every culture in the world has its N.P.C.s. You know, if you don't know, that stands for non-player character, someone who is just told what to think and what to do, and that they do it. And that's the masses of humans. But Russia needs to tell its own N.P.C.s what to think. And I don't necessarily mean like a totalitarian society where the state is just completely 1984 style programming. Not exactly, but there is a leadership in society that directs what the common worldview should be. And if you want to protect your people and guide them in the direction that you want them to go in, whether for good or hopefully for good, can be for bad, but the point is you need to protect them from foreign interference. I mean, that's the same thing that the elite class would go on about, you know, Trump being elected because of Russian interference, which I don't think was true. But there is this idea there that has some truth. That, I mean, there's always foreign interference. That's a real thing, and a lot of that has to do with propaganda. So Facebook, I mean, again, you use these social media sites for your own purposes, and losing them can hurt you. It's true. But at the same time, the management of these corporations is focused on censoring views that it doesn't agree with if it gets any wide traction. Like my YouTube channel would be censored probably if it got too big, and I think it's been shadow banned for many years. But this is why I'm not so cynical about these corporations, these tech giants being banned from Russia. I mean, it can help Russia. They can develop their own social media. I think they probably already have to some degree. But I just think that, you know, removing like McDonald's from Russia, like that's good for Russians. Removing like Twitter from Russia. I mean this stuff is poisonous. It's poisonous here in America and Canada. Lastly, just this idea, these sanctions, this economic hardship for both sides. I have a friend who thinks that Russians are being hit very hard by this. I don't know. Maybe I guess they are. I mean, I guess we all are being hit. He thought it was going to be a situation where Putin is going to be assassinated by another Russian oligarch or maybe someone in the military because this hardship, the collapse of the ruble, and someone will say, well, this has to end. Let's take him out. But I don't know. I'm not so sure that that'll happen. First of all, I don't know what the real economic hardship, the scale of it is right now. Is it worse than it could be in America or Canada? Because we've got huge inflation here already. And then that happened before this Ukraine war started. The inflation of gas prices, food prices have been going up. Who do you think is in a better position to endure hard times? Would it be a person in a culture who has endured the bread lines of the Soviet Union? Or would it be a person in a culture who has endured the lines at Best Buy on a Black Friday? Hasta luego, amigos!